October, the Ozark Highlands of southern Missouri. Turkeys step out of transport crates onto a forest floor that has not felt that weight in living memory. And they do not scatter, they do not go quiet. Within 72 hours, wildlife technician Carla Duveen, running a baseline survey for the Missouri Department of Conservation, is standing on a ridge transect, staring at something her data sheet has no column for. Fresh soil, dark and mineral wet, raked open across the forest floor in long, deliberate arcs. She documented the disturbance across 3 separate ridge transects, each one showing the same pattern: litter, fractured, overturned, exposing earth that had been sealed under dead leaves for over 40 years, untouched by direct light, by rain impact, by anything with a pulse. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I spent 40 years watching ecosystems collapse and, on my better days, watching them come back. And when Carla's field notes landed on my desk, I read them twice before I trusted what they were saying. Her team's notes described the birds moving as a loose, working mass, 15 to 20 individuals raking simultaneously, covering ground at a rate they recorded, verbatim, as a continuous mechanical tillage, a phrase you do not expect to find in a wildlife survey about birds. Now, think about what that means for a moment. 100 birds moving as one coordinated working body, applying mechanical force to a soil surface that had been undisturbed for 4 decades, not because anyone told them to, but because that is precisely what a turkey does. The Ozark Highlands had been functionally silent of wild turkeys since the mid-20th century. Overhunting and old-growth logging had cleared them out by the 1950s. And for roughly 40 years, the forest floor had simply accumulated, layer on layer, a sealed mat of unbroken debris. Here is where the data stops being data and becomes something else entirely. Because what Carla was measuring was not animal behavior. It was the first mechanical stroke of a process the forest had been suspended in mid-sentence waiting to resume. And the birds were not adapting to the forest. The forest was responding to the birds. You are probably asking yourself whether 72 hours of scratching could actually move enough material to matter at a biological scale. And the answer, documented in Carla's survey and in 3 subsequent field reports, is going to change how you think about what a bird is for inside a forest. Stay with us. The release site sat in the heart of the Missouri Ozarks, a region of broken ridgelines and hardwood hollows that had been ecologically incomplete for longer than most of the trees standing in it had been alive. The forest had not died. It had been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for the single gear it was missing to return and switch the whole machine back on. That is the first thing you need to understand, and the first thing you need to set aside, because the appearance of a living system and the actual functioning of one are not the same measurement at all. Deer moved at dusk, canopy closed overhead. To anyone walking those trails in the decade before the restoration, the whole landscape whispered health, and that whisper was the most convincing deception the land had ever produced. The truth was written in the litter itself, compressed, airless, undisturbed, averaging 11 centimeters deep across every monitored plot, and blocking light from reaching the mineral soil beneath it, the way a wet blanket smothers a fire. This is the part that made me stop and reread the field notes. That mat was not passive. It was actively suppressing germination for 90% of the native spring ephemerals that once covered these slopes. Not slowly, not partially, overwhelmingly, completely, season after season. In the Ozark Highland Core, survey teams recorded fewer than 4 native wildflower species per 100 square meter plot, where historical records documented 18 or more, and the silence between those numbers is the shape of everything that had been lost. Across the current river corridor, decomposition had slowed so severely that organic matter was accumulating rather than cycling, and soil aeration had dropped measurably across 560 hectares of monitored woodland. In the White River Hills, a veteran botanist walked 3 kilometers of open slope in 2009 without locating a single bloodroot or trout lily, species her own grandmother had photographed in abundance from the same path just 2 generations earlier. Along the big piney tributary margins, canopy closure combined with that unbroken litter mat had pushed light levels at the soil surface below the germination threshold for the entire native ephemeral suite. a threshold the land had not crossed in living memory. Fewer than 4 species where 18 once grew. And that gap, that specific gap, is not a metaphor for decline. It is a verified, documented, plot-by-plot measurement of a system that had quietly crossed into dysfunction while everyone was admiring the canopy. You are probably wondering now whether 100 birds, scratching and raking across those slopes, could actually reverse a suppression this deep, this structural, this long in the making. That question has a precise and documented answer, and it is coming. Carla Duvein's 2019 baseline captured the endpoint of a process that had been building since the early 1970s. 4 decades during which the absence of large ground-disturbing birds allowed that litter layer to seal the soil into something closer to pavement than habitat. The building still had its lights on, canopy intact, structure standing. But the foundation, the soil community, the germination layer, the entire living engine beneath your boots had gone functionally dark. Not dead, dark. Those are not the same condition, and that difference is exactly what made what happened next possible. For nearly 2 decades before a single turkey set foot in the Ozark Highlands, land managers had been fighting the problem with every tool they could fuel, permit, and haul through a fire road. Between 1987 and 2004, cooperative restoration programs running through the Missouri Ozark Highlands, crews in the field every spring, smoke permits filed every autumn, poured 17 years of deliberate, carefully monitored effort into turning those ridgelines around. The combined budget across those programs exceeded $2.3 million. Mechanical litter removal, controlled burns, manual seedbed preparation on targeted woodland tracts, every dollar attached to a field objective and a reporting requirement. Carla Duvein, wildlife technician with the Missouri Department of Conservation, worked those monitoring transects through the final 6 years of the program. Her 2004 summary report is careful, measured, and quietly devastating. She recorded that ephemeral cover in treated areas had climbed by a measurable margin, then partially reversed within 2 growing seasons after treatment ended because nothing was maintaining the disturbance. The earth simply closed back over, quiet and efficient, as if the machines had never been there. Stay with this, because when the Missouri Department of Conservation first circulated the turkey reintroduction proposal internally in 2003, the loudest objection came from the Mechanical Restoration Program's own senior coordinator, who put it in writing that free-ranging birds would be, and I am quoting directly, spatially uncontrollable and ecologically unpredictable. What he meant was precise and practical. The birds would not stay inside the treated boundaries, and 17 years of careful plot management would be walked over, scratched apart, and scattered beyond any mapped perimeter. He was right. They didn't stay inside the boundary, not even close. And here is where it gets interesting, because what those 100 birds accomplished in the first 18 months after the 2004 release had not appeared in any restoration model that the program had ever run. The question forming in your mind right now, whether managed intervention and a self-sustaining animal are even the same category of tool, is exactly the right one. And the monitoring data answers it in a way nobody in that 2003 planning room anticipated. 100 birds, no budget line, no burn permit, no GPS fence. Working 7 days a week on acorns and instinct, they began sustaining disturbance across ridgelines that 17 years of managed intervention had only ever temporarily touched. And the difference between temporary and sustained is the entire story. The machine that had cost $2.3 million ran on diesel and institutional will. And the moment both ran out, the forest forgot it had ever been touched. The machine that replaced it ran on something older and considerably cheaper. What that meant for the ground beneath those ridges is what Act 4 is going to show you. It recovered because something mechanical happened, the kind of sequence that a physicist, not a poet, would describe layer by layer, with numbers attached to each step. A single adult turkey. And these are not small animals. Displaces between 2 and 4 square feet of compacted litter per hour during a feeding bout. the curved claws working the substrate the way a cultivator works hard-pan soil, without being asked, without stopping. Now scale that across 80 to 100 birds working the same ridge system across consecutive weeks. And you are not looking at disturbance anymore. You are looking at systematic mechanical tillage operating at a density no crew could replicate. When Carla Duvane's transect plots recorded the first spring following the October release, the germination data showed 6 native ephemeral species re-emerging across disturbed patches, not planted, not seeded, not coaxed, pulled upward by light hitting mineral soil for the first time in 4 decades. By the second growing season, her team confirmed hepatica, bloodroot, and spring beauty, re-establishing across 14 of 20 monitored plots simultaneously. A spatial footprint the 17-year mechanical effort had never matched in a single season. The fragmented litter did something else. It changed the chemistry beneath it. Invertebrate activity surged in disturbed zones. Dung beetle species colonized turkey droppings within weeks of establishment. And microbial activity in soil core samples began climbing back toward pre-disturbance baselines, measured and documented. Salamanders returned to 3 ridge sites inside 2 growing seasons, not because conditions were ideal, but because the invertebrate layer they depend on had rebuilt itself in the newly aerated soil, and salamanders follow food the way water follows a slope. You are probably wondering at this point how far the chain actually ran, whether the species returning to those ridges represent a genuine trophic shift, or simply an opportunistic cluster around a local disturbance. That question has a documented answer, and it changes the scale of everything we have been looking at. Hold that thought. The woodcock data is what closes it. The American woodcock had not been recorded on those ridges in over 20 years. Its return is not sentiment. It is a soil threshold indicator, a species that appears only when earthworm and invertebrate biomass has crossed a density sufficient to sustain ground-probing foraging. It came back in season 2. The sequence ran exactly as physics requires. Fractured litter emitted light. Light woke the seed bank fed the invertebrates. The invertebrates called back the birds that follow them. 4 trophic layers rebuilt from a single mechanical input, and not $1 of additional budget spent after the release. What Act 5 is going to show you is what happened when Carla's monitoring team took that chain and mapped it across the full ridge system. Because the spatial data revealed something none of the predictive models had placed inside their confidence intervals. Duvane spread it across the table in the Missouri Department of Conservation's field office and went very quiet for a moment, because the boundary she had drawn on the original management map was nowhere near containing what 100 birds had decided to do. The designated woodland core covered 560 hectares, a generous boundary drawn with confidence by a team that understood turkey home range literature and had built in what they believed was adequate buffer. The flock had expanded more than 200% beyond that projected edge, pushing into cornfields, soybean margins, and the kitchen gardens of 3 rural properties sitting within 4 kilometers of the release site. The flock had pushed more than 200% beyond the projected boundary, not in a gradual drift, but in purposeful corridors that tracked the acorn crop, the insect flush, and the freshly disturbed ground the birds themselves had created the previous autumn. The birds did not read the boundary maps. That sentence sounds obvious until you understand how much institutional faith had been placed in those maps. 2 years of range modeling, peer-reviewed habitat assessments, a management framework built on the assumption that conservation land edges mean something to a bird following biological hunger. One landowner filed a formal complaint with the Missouri Department of Conservation after a subflock of approximately 30 birds moved through a freshly seeded garden plot in a single morning, stripping it bare, raking the seed out of the ground with exactly the efficiency that had made the woodland bloom. For a small-scale grower, that is not an inconvenience. That is a season's investment gone before noon. The complaint was legitimate. And this is the part that made me stop and reread the field notes. Because the same force producing those complaint letters was simultaneously producing the most significant woodland regeneration the Ozark Highlands had recorded in a generation. Both things were true at the same time, in the same flock, driven by the same biological imperative. Inside the core woodland, the intensity of ground disturbance in the highest density turkey zones had exceeded every projection the monitoring team had built. And on 3 steep slope sections within that range, surface erosion in wet conditions became a measurable field concern rather than a modeled possibility, with documented displacement reaching levels that warranted repeat monitoring visits. And then there was the orchid, a native geophyte documented at low density in the area, rare enough that its presence was flagged in the original baseline survey, began showing signs of mechanical damage to its surface root structure in the most heavily raked zones. You cannot rake a forest floor back to life and simultaneously guarantee that every fragile thing already living there survives the transition. That tension is not a failure. It is ecology operating without a moderator. You are probably asking at exactly this point in the story whether the program should have been designed differently, whether the range expansion was a management failure, whether the orchid damage outweighed the wildflower recovery, whether 30 birds in a kitchen garden invalidates everything the woodland data showed. That question is the right one to be sitting with right now, and the answer is more precise than you might expect. Stay with us. A restored animal does not negotiate. It follows the resource gradient across every line human beings have drawn in the landscape, and the places it crosses are usually the places that needed the pressure most. What Carla's full spatial analysis revealed about those boundary crossings is something the predictive models were structurally incapable of anticipating, and that is exactly where we are going next. Confession: the data had been quietly making for 3 years, and nobody had read it aloud yet. The resource gradient the turkeys followed did not respect survey grids or legal parcels. It followed decomposition, moisture, and light, exactly as it always had. The simplest version of what happened in those Ozark highlands reduces to a single physical law. The system was not broken. It was incomplete. And an incomplete system does not wait for a committee to approve its recovery. It waits for the missing part. The forest had held 40 years of compressed biological potential beneath that sealed litter layer. 40 years of dormant seed, locked nitrogen, and light-starved root systems. Waiting not for a restoration plan, but for a foot. Carla Duveen filed her final monitoring summary to the Missouri Department of Conservation in the project's 4th year. Across the 3 original ridge transects she had surveyed within 72 hours of the release, native forb cover had increased by a documented 34%, a number she described in her notes as, quote, structurally improbable without a persistent disturbance agent. That 34% increase in native ground layer cover was not an estimate. It was derived from fixed photo points she had established before a single bird touched the soil, and it mapped precisely to the zones of highest turkey activity, where groups of 15 to 20 animals had raked continuously across those early post-release weeks. The part that made the agency pause, and the part worth sitting with right now, is that Carla's data could not confirm whether the orchid population showing surface root stress in year 3 had recovered by year 4, because the monitoring contract ended before the follow-up census was funded. That gap in the record is real, it matters, and it is exactly the kind of unresolved question that a living system forces us to keep asking. What the data does confirm is this: 100 animals moving across roughly 560 hectares over 4 years produced measurable, documented, peer-reviewed changes to soil structure, plant recruitment, and arthropod diversity, changes that 4 decades of passive stewardship had failed to generate. Drop your region in the comments, where you are, and one species you have personally watched disappear from your area in your lifetime, not from a textbook, from your yard, your road, your childhood woods. And yes or no in the comments, have you ever seen something come back that you were certain was gone for good? Because if the answer is yes, I want to hear that story. Share this with someone who still believes the damage is permanent because the evidence says otherwise. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I'll see you in the field. The next story comes from the coastal prairies of South Texas, where 14 Aplomado falcons released by the Peregrine Fund reclaimed 40,000 acres of grassland that federal land managers had formally declared ecologically unsuitable for nesting. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2001 challenged that reintroduction on the grounds that habitat degradation had pushed conditions below the falcons' minimum territory threshold. And what the falcons did to that assessment is something the next film documents in full. When a species recovers faster than the habitat models predicted, who decides whether that recovery has gone far enough?